The United States has benefited in a variety of ways since the start of the conflict in Ukraine. First, American corporations have been shipping tanks and armaments made in the country to Ukraine. This explains the sharp increase in stock prices for defense-related companies. But selling gas and oil to Europe is another way the US generates billions of dollars in revenue. That's correct. Despite having some of the most developed nations in the world, the ancient continent is heavily dependent on the importation of energy resources. Here in this graph you will see how dependent Europe is on its pre-war imports of oil, coal, and natural gas. When it comes to oil, Europe imported 27% of all its oil from Russia. When it comes to coal, Europe imported 47% from Russia. And finally, Europe's most important resource, natural gas, 41% was imported from Russia. However, due to sanctions imposed by Europe and the United States on Russia as a result of the conflict in Ukraine, Russia is unable to export these energy resources. This caused chaos in Europe during 2022. Electricity prices skyrocketed 3 times, as you will see here. The European economy slowed down and it was feared that this winter was going to be apocalyptic in Europe. But none of that happened since Europe was able to find alternatives to its energy imports. In this case, the United States came out on top because it was sending a lot of gas to the country. It sold a lot of gas at a premium for export. As a result, American oil firms earned hundreds of millions of dollars in 2022, setting a record. Hundreds of millions of dollars in 2022 as the record earnings. There are more specifics to this narrative, though. In this video, we'll look at how the US is profiting from the conflict in Ukraine as well as how it is exploiting Europe, its closest partner. Watch all the way through because we'll also see how this will hurt the European economy. This is the port of Rotterdam, which is situated outside of the Netherlands on the North Sea's Atlantic coast. The most significant port in all of Europe, where daily import and export transactions totaling billions of dollars take place. This port mostly transports processed and modern products created in Europe in containers. But as you can see, there are a lot of these ships in the harbor right now. The vast majority of these ships, which are designed expressly to transport liquefied natural gas, are manufactured in the United States. As I previously stated, since the war began and sanctions against Russia were put in place, Europe was compelled to switch from Russian gas to gas from the United States. Here in this graph you will see exactly how all this happened. As you will see, before the war, Russia was the largest exporter of natural gas to Europe, followed by Norway and North African countries. But with the outbreak of the war, slowly countries like the US and Qatar move up the list, until the US becomes the second largest exporter to Europe. Anyone could say that Europe successfully managed to replace Russian gas and is now independent of Russia. However, the reliance on the US is now greater than ever, which is bad news for Europe. First, let me explain how Europe has profited from cheap Russian natural gas for many years. Russia is by far the world's largest producer of natural gas, as you'll see in this chart. As a result, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Europe has started to build trade ties with Russia that are based on the export of gas and oil. Europe may be the most industrialized continent in the world, as I've already indicated, but that very industrialization is also its Achilles heel. Is that the continent depends heavily on imported energy. Since gas from Russia is so cheap, I'd even venture to say that Europe's industrialization reached this point because of it. If you are enjoying this video and want to be aware of new videos, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. However, 2 events that occurred after the fall of the Soviet Union increased these imports. First, or at least in theory, Russia transitioned to democracy and capitalism. Second, Europe was preparing to reduce its carbon dioxide emissions in order to reduce global warming. When this occurred, Europe grew closer to Russia commercially because Russia could offer it cheap gas and always delivered. Germany reaped the greatest rewards from this alliance. Due to the inexpensive gas from Russia, Germany saw unprecedented economic growth. Germany employed this gas for its chemical industry, home heating, and electricity generation. By acquiring inexpensive energy, they were able to cut the cost of the goods they produced and increase their competitiveness with other nations. As a result, importing gas was quite advantageous. The bond between the two countries grew so strong that the former German chancellor was appointed chairman of the board of Gazprom, the Russian firm that supplied the gas to Germany. And after the construction of the two most significant gas pipelines in the world, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, that partnership developed into a lasting one. As a result of Europe's marriage to Russia, Europe was now more dependent than ever on Russian gas. Thus, we arrive at the present day and the catastrophe that is the war in Ukraine. The Europeans caused themselves great economic harm by sanctioning Russia. The primary source of cheap energy for Europe vanished overnight. Everyone anticipated genuine economic disaster as a result. By switching to American and Norwegian gas in place of Russian gas, Europe was able to prevent this chaos. Anyone could sing the victory and claim that Europe managed to avoid a financial crisis. But for two reasons, this is not the case. Pipelines allowed Russian gas to flow continuously and incredibly cheaply in the first place. And this is where we need to think like business people. Imagine if one of the key components in the production of all products is energy. As a producer, you will raise your pricing to make up for any disruptions or increases in the price of energy. By increasing your costs, you make your products less competitive with those of other industrialized nations like China, Japan, Korea, and the US. Therefore, Europe greatly benefited from having cheap and plentiful energy. However, this benefit is no longer available, and European businesses must now pay significantly more for their energy imports and electricity production. The United States and its businesses are greatly gaining from this circumstance, which is where they come in. Oil businesses and figures experienced historic earnings in 2022, amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars. U.S. businesses like Chevron and Exxon made a combined total of more than $200 billion. Furthermore, as you might expect, these businesses have a significant impact on Washington's politicians, so it is in their best interests for the war to continue and for Russia to adhere to the embargo. Let's now take a step back and return to Europe to discuss the long-term effects of this. Even though an economic collapse was avoided, the German Chamber of Industry and Commerce predicted in February 2023 that German industries would have a bad year. Said chamber had a survey with the leaders of the 27,000 most important companies in Germany, and 30% see a very bad 2023. All of this is a result of the fact that 85% of businesses consider the price of natural resources and energy to be the biggest risk. In general, it is predicted that German industry will pay 40% more for energy in 2023 than it did in 2021. As you can expect, paying 40% more for electricity is a significant sum, and the pricing of the goods they manufacture will reflect this. German companies are no longer competitive with other nations due to their more expensive products, and Europe's inflation rate is still high. As a result of the European central banks' need to boost interest rates to counteract this excessive inflation, the economic situation is made even worse. But as interest rates rise at the central bank, the economy also contracts. You now understand that Europe is caught in a vicious cycle, and that the sanctions imposed in response to the war in Ukraine are to blame. However, because the United States and its businesses are the ones who sell gas and oil to Europe at higher prices, they are not complaining. Another detail can be found here. The so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which the U.S. government also put into effect, will grant American businesses more than $369 billion to help them compete with foreign firms and produce goods at reduced costs. In order to compete with the Europeans, the United States not only sells expensive gas to Europe, but it also subsidizes its own companies. The Americans might therefore be criticized for exploiting the situation by selling more expensive gas to Europe and then subsidizing their companies to outcompete the Europeans in the market. Sadly, if they maintain the sanctions, Europe will be forced to accept these conditions. However, both in the short and long terms, this is a very serious issue for Europe. Now that the globe is becoming less globalized and there is a Cold War between the West and the East, it appears that the economy will suffer and that Europe's golden age will come to an end. Your thoughts and predictions for Europe and the US in the coming years are welcome. Post a comment with your thoughts on the matter.